Al, on the way here, I just checked with you, and you came here in 1954. How did a fellow from Prince Albert end up in Chalk River?
Well, you may not realize this, but immediately after the war for several years, it was difficult to get work. And as a chemical engineer, I went working at the mines at Flin Flon, Manitoba. And I was there for 4 years. But we got overwhelmed with the cold weather and the smoke, and my wife said, like, she liked to garden and all, and every once in a while you'd be blanketed with this. And she said, we just got to leave here, this is terrible. So CRNL was one of the people who advertised across the country for employers, Chalk River.
Right.
So I answered an ad and then eventually ended up here.
Aha. Where did you go to university?
In Saskatoon.
In Saskatoon, okay. And when you got here in 54, it was after the big accident in NRX. It was just the exciting period of setting up for NRU. And NRX was by far the best reactor and source in the world. There must have been a lot of activities going on.
There was. And I can't provide enough compliments for the people who designed that, starting from scratch. It's wonderfully well built, and having said that, it had a million problems as well. But you know, you have to take your hats off to the people who designed that, starting from what knowledge they got from the States with that reactor down
and just
there.
a bit from ZEEP, and that was it, yeah?
Yeah, and so they did a wonderful job. Having said that, it was a lousy machine.
That period was also important for the beginning of the production of isotopes, and also plutonium was being produced.
Right.
The plutonium was going down to the U.S. at that time.
There was the whole impetus for our operation at least for, I would say, 2 years after we got going, was there by the guy that was in charge of the nuclear submarine program in the States,
Rickover.
Rickover. He dictated the operation of NRU effectively for a couple of years. Everything we did was slated at testing his high pressure temperature fuels and rigs and so on, which eventually led to their nuclear submarines. So they really dictated. I mean, of course, we had to shut down to do certain things, but our whole schedule was built around Rickover and his demands for develop these high pressure, high temperature, compact, well, we called them loops, but whatever he called them.
Right.
Rigs, and they eventually used to power their nuclear submarines.
We were producing plut to send down to the Americans during that period also.
Oh, yes.
And was that going out on shipments on trucks? I mean, these days, if you try to ship something like that, there's a huge protest and road blockages and everything else, but we succeeded in those days.
Well, I'll have to invoke my version of the Fifth Amendment. American is to protect the speaker. To me, is to protect my memory.
Okay, that's
no,
fine.
I'll answer it like this. We shipped by truck. The Americans would send trucks up. The time scales, I'm completely confused. And they had a lot of trouble with, I'll call them bleeding hearts, trying to stop the trucks on the road. Do you remember that? No, it's before your time.
Oh, even at that time, okay.
They were blocking the roads, and these guys were going different routes and doing this and doing that to avoid them. These incidents may be totally out of context in time. I can't remember that, but that's what we were doing. It was going down by special truck to the Americans to, I think it was Savannah.
Right.
Georgia, to be processed.
Okay. Around that time also, there were a lot of other sort of third world countries who were beginning to get interested in nuclear power. and they were seeing NRX as the model they should follow. So we had a lot of groups here. Were the Indians the first, or were there others as well?
I'm not sure, but they
Sure.
were certainly one of the earlier ones.
Right. And in fact, Al has donated to the society a kakuru, a knife that was used by the Gurkhas to slay their opponents, and it was given to him as a souvenir after the Indians had gone back to India.
Well, that's approximately right. I believe they gave it to me in Canada before they left,
Right.
but that's an insignificant point. But
Yeah. You went to India for a period there as well, did you?
no, I did not.
Aha.
I had very, very little involvement in the CIR reactor.
Okay.
Practically zero. Well, I mean, we trained the people in Chalk River, but
Right.
aside from that, it's hard to believe, but I've never been in there. I've never been in that reactor in India. I went over there one time. I think I was being sent to Pakistan, but I'm not sure, and I stopped for a courtesy visit with the people there. And by one device or another, oh yeah, we'll see the reactor, but we'll do this first. And finally I said, well, it's too late to do that now, knowing very well that my ticket was booked. So I never got into the reactor, and I was very, very suspicious at that point. Rightly so, as it turned out.
Right.
But they never let me into that reactor. Because, you know, it would give me 20 minutes in there. I could tell them, you know, I would know whether they were diverting fuel as they
Right.
were and so on.
Right.
But I had very little involvement with it. I think maybe it was John Sproul that went over with them.
Right. Okay.
He was gone somewhere for a number of months.
That's right.
Or maybe it was this outfit. Do you know what Canadim is?
Oh, yes, yes.
They were going to be the front and center sort of some way for
Right.
ACL, maybe. But I have to say, I know I have had very little to do with CIR, and I know very little about it.
But you did go to Pakistan for a period?
Yeah, for some reason or other.
Okay.
I don't remember why.
That's right. Now, Chalk River is the only place who has really ever replaced calandrias on reactors. Those must have been both exciting and confusing and rush times for everyone.
Well, I wouldn't admit they were confusing. I think we were we were pretty well organized.
Okay.
But they were, you know, we were dealing with high radiation. It was an enormous problem for the RNIS people and the safety people, health people.
And also a panic to try to do it, not necessarily a panic, but to try to really keep to the schedule because of the interruption of the isotope production.
Well, that would be secondary, of course. We did it as expeditiously and as safely as we could, but
Right.
the furthest thing from our mind at that point was it was getting out of the building and getting it buried before we exposed the whole population. And it went very slowly, but it went very well. We had 40 tons of shielding, well, 40 tons, I'm exaggerating, on the biggest machine we had was a road grader. And when we loaded the calandria on whatever we loaded it on, they pulled it with this road grader, and the guy had about 50 tons of lead behind him to shield him as he took it out to the disposal grounds. But, you know, it went very well, but it was slow and dangerous from a point of view of radiation. I mean, not that radiation kills a person very quickly or anything, but
Yes, a difficult job that not many people in the world have ever tried. As you spent time at Chalk River, you moved up the chain of responsibility in odds and ends. Later on, both NRU and NRX were beginning to feel their age on things, and parts for things like control systems were hard to obtain. And what were some of your memories of the difficulties and experiences in through there?
well, of course, changing the vessel would be the major thing in NRX. The other biggest single factor was that the metallurgist, none of us realized how uranium moves around under radiation. It expands or it lengthens or it does this or it cracks. And the biggest continuing problem in NRX was to get the best possible fuel that wouldn't foul up in some way. They would, it was metal rods.
Right.
And the original rods, the biggest problem was that they would fatten up and split their sheaths under irradiation. And so Jack Nellis was the metallurgist, was working on trying to find a satisfactory rod, and we tried half a dozen different heat treatments and sheathing and spacing and so on to try and make these things last. But ruptured rods was a continuing problem in NRX because of fuel blockage. They expand to the point they started cutting off the flow at the bottom. So that was a continuing problem, and it was eventually solved by using a beta heat-treated uranium metal with 4% cold work. And that elongated at a predictable rate. And we made some modifications to give it a little more room at the end, and we got a reasonable life out of those rods. And that was towards the end of metal rods period. They were later on went to oxides, but so that was a problem that bugged us in NRX for most of its life, was getting fuel that would not split its sheath or do something else.
The loops in NRX were something that were unique for reactors also. We have at the museum here one of the whistles from one of the loops when I guess it went either high pressure or high temperature. Were they something that people...
One of a million faults, but anyway, yes.
Would the whistle cause great concern onto people? Could you distinguish which loop the whistle was from?
Well, if you couldn't distinguish, I could, or the next guy could. And each one was different.
Right.
So they knew which one was acting up. I mean, with half a dozen operators out there was no question about which one was acting up.
Right. You had some responsibility and some interaction for NPD as well. What was your involvement there?
Do you know the name of the guy that was a liaison with the NPD to begin with?
I'm afraid not.
It doesn't matter. Anyway, he was in charge, but he got sick and left, and I became the contact with NPD, which meant mostly agreeing to spend money to get them more heavy water or something. And I held meetings once a month with them at CRNL, and half a dozen of their senior people would come up and fill me in on what was happening with the fuel rods, what was happening with the storage bays and so on. And they'd each give a 15-minute talk, and that was really the basis of my most involvement with them until it was decided to take the fuel out. But, so my involvement was really minimal. They had very competent staff there in the Ontario Hydro employees originally. And so as I say, I kept abreast of what was going on by these monthly meetings with their senior, heads of various sections.
Right. But towards the end of your career in Chalk River, you really had oversight over a lot of operations area. And are you
like all of it?
Like all of it, yes. And how did you enjoy that compared to when you first came and were able to get your hands in on equipment and things of that manner?
Well, let us put it this way. I've always said I enjoyed the other 8 hours of my life aside from sleeping and working. That's what made life worthwhile.
Interesting.
Do you understand what I mean?
Yes, interesting times.
It didn't bear heavily on me.
Okay, good.
I would make 1,000 nasty decisions every month based on incomplete information and hope you did the right thing.
Right.
With the 2 reactors. I mean, good as they were, there were a bee's nest of problems.
And there was huge pressure, I guess, at one time we were producing approaching 90% of the isotopes, medical isotopes for the world, and the demands of that must have overridden almost everything else.
Well, they were certainly important, but
the moly that was produced here, etc., all got shipped to Ottawa on almost a weekly basis, or
Moly 99, yeah.
My records indicate you've been retired for approaching 35 years now.
1983, whatever that makes it.
Yes, and you continue to enjoy nature. You continue to enjoy the outdoors. Any advice for people who are looking what to do after they've retired? How do you keep active?
Well, I don't know about after retired, but and I used to go and address people after I was retired. They used to have me down to talk to potential retirees to soothe their transition from. And my advice was, well, you better have a plan. You better know exactly what you're going to do when you walk out that door, otherwise you'll be a lost waif. And that's important. Have a plan. Go to New Zealand and watch the kiwi birds or something.
Yeah. You and Hazel did a lot of traveling, particularly into the north.
Well, she didn't do much traveling up north, although she did a little. That was pretty well all. She would do her thing in Los Angeles, counting whatever she did in her Arctic things, and I would go to the Arctic.
Where did you go in the Arctic mainly?
Well, from Newfoundland to Alaska. You know, I've been in 25 or more trips in the Arctic, so you asked me that question. A lot of places.
You did some hiking onto Baffin Island as well, I think. Is that right?
I did very little hiking on Baffin Island, a little, but most of it was on where we just went on hiking trips. Actually, it was on Ellesmere Island.
Ellesmere, okay.
Where most of it was with canoes, but not all. Some were hiking trips. I'm a poor hiker, you know. You get 60 pounds of food and clothes on your back. It's pretty hard to enjoy a hike.
Particularly in the Husky.
Well, it doesn't matter where you are.
Yeah.
So usually it was rivers. Not all, but mostly. And I've been on, not all, but many of the major rivers across the north. You know, from the Spanish River to the I can't even think of the name, but there's a fairly major river on Victoria Island, for example. Canoed that. My last long canoe trip. Most miserable one, too, for cold, bad weather, bad rapids.
Al has also been a lifetime bird watcher, and he's taken part in almost every bird count in Deep River since the 1950s.
And I have seen a quetzal.
Ah, yes. Well, that I must admit I haven't. Well, we thank you, Al, very much for making time to come and visit with us this morning. And it's great to see you still interested in the outdoors and able to share some memories with us.
You're most welcome, but I have to add the caveat that you're talking to a very old and worn out memory.
Well, they all get that way eventually,
if
we hope.
If you've got any information to the contrary to what I've said, That's recorded. Use that information, not my memory.
Well, thank you very much.